It's a story that is surprising and perhaps contradicting what we usually hear about the Nazi Protectorate. There are definitely fundamental similarities in the nature of Nazi welfare state with the pre-war and post-war periods.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast with me, Rosamund Johnston. Today we're joined by Radka Šustrová, my colleague at the Research Center for the History of Transformations and a prolific author, most recently of a book titled Nations Apart, Czech Nationalism and Authoritarian Welfare Under Nazi Rule. And that was released last year by Oxford University Press. So Radka, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's start with this book, Nations Apart. In it, if I understand it correctly, you are charting how a welfare state was formed in the Bohemian lands during actually the war years, the Nazi occupation. Can you talk a little bit about what characterised this welfare state and maybe how it differentiated itself or was different from maybe some of the post-war iterations of the welfare state we might be more familiar with?
It's a story that is surprising and perhaps contradicting what we usually hear about the Nazi Protectorate. There are definitely fundamental similarities in the nature of Nazi welfare state with the pre-war and post-war periods. All along, the central pillar was social insurance. So you were automatically insured against sickness, accident and old age if you were employed. Because there was a constant pressure to maximize the number of workers during the Second World War, the number of injured also increased. Alongside this, there were several non-entitlement benefits that you can claim, but there was no guarantee that you will receive this support. But there was also one critical difference in the Nazi welfare state. Those who could draw benefits and aid were exclusively the Gentile population. That's it, that non-Jewish and non-Roma Czechs and Germans could be part of the system and use the funds to support themselves and their families. Thus, in definition, social policy, society as a beneficiary was replaced by a nation. That's the big difference.
So that's actually something I'd like to ask you about. So I know that very important in your work is the term social justice, but can we talk about such a thing as Nazi social justice when, as you just mentioned, entire groups, Jewish people, Roma people, were excluded from sort of being members of this society? How useful is social justice a term, I suppose, for thinking about this period?
Above all, I think we need to stress that it's important to clarify that social justice is not a liberal democratic concept. It's more our prevailing feeling today. Each regime has its own definition and therefore National Socialism had it too. Also in the Nazi Protectorate and Ostmark, annexed Austria, there were institutions that were supposed to guarantee the provision of fair treatment, including trade unions, labor and social insurance courts. Studying archival sources, I am not interested in what was just in the past, but where and how social justice was sought and became negotiable. And I have to admit that I was very surprised at how many people had disputes with their employees over pensions and payments. They started a legal battle because they believed that they were in the right. So often these were non-intellectuals, manual or auxiliary workers. And I think that the challenge and the benefit of studying social justice is to observe the linkage between the regime's promises and how those promises were read by ordinary people. It's based on an ever-evolving interaction, which is why I speak primarily of social justice in the making.
So ultimately, you argue that this welfare system that was developed in the Protectorate contributed, and I quote here, to the social stabilisation and the legitimisation of Nazi rule in the Bohemian lands. So I want to ask you a bit more about how.
We could paraphrase it as you work for us, and in return, we pay you to ensure that you do not fall into poverty if an unexpected event, such as illness, injury, or death happens. So they practice a kind of a good governance, expressing aspects of good governance and good administration in response to the bad practices of prevailing ruling classes and governments. They aimed to economic and social stabilization of the country. So I see a fundamental link between the social redistribution and Czech national identity too, which was strengthened not only through cultural projects, publishing Czech newspapers and literature and performing Czech theatre plays, but also through an ethnically defined society. The Nazi welfare state was organized along national lines, which in practice meant that there were parallel Czech and German structures separating the Czech and German populations. So the title of my book, Nations Apart, refers to this segregation.
And if I understand it correctly, having read your book, a lot of it is sort of real high politics and government sources and experts on work coming up with these systems. And if I understand it correctly, your new research is a lot more looking at maybe at the factory level and at what workers themselves did with these regulations and these ideas about welfare state and social justice. Do you find looking at those sorts of sources produced at the factory level that people are speaking the same language, or are people using the same terms to say fundamentally different things, do you think?
That's a very good question. Actually, Nations Apart is much more written from the perspective of the state agencies, because until then the historiography provided only little information about the whole system in the Nazi-occupied Bohemian lands. Still, I think the story I have written is much about the people, Czechs and Germans who implemented the new norms and those who had to cope with the norms in their everyday lives. In my current research, I want to get closer to the people because I think we need to study political regimes and their proclamations, but this is only a limited perspective in terms of exploring social realities. So when we get interested in what people experienced, which means exploring history from below, we can see how these conversations about social justice, conversation held at the political level and then somewhere in the workplace, are varied. They are certainly not the same conversations because the way political proclamations are translated into language of the working class is specific and individual and highly dependent on particular conditions. And how people spoke about social justice differed, but these conversations went in a similar direction. They articulated social justice as one of the achievable goals of contemporary societies and often used comparable arguments.
And one of the things you're also doing with your new research, which is something I'm very interested in and also trying to do, is think about Czechoslovakia in comparison, in parallel and in connection with Austria. Can I ask you why you chose to do this and what you think this comparison gives us?
I think that any comparison is always beneficial. Telling only national stories in isolation does not give us much opportunity to think in a broader context. But in this particular case, the comparison between Czechoslovakia and Austria, I see several similarities between both countries, starting with the situation during the Second World War. There are also similar traditions and languages in the world of labor, and despite the fact that the countries were on the opposite sides of the Iron Curtain, the post-war development also shows interesting similarities. This is mainly related to the desire to create institutions of social dialogue and social justice that would eliminate conflicts and guarantee fair and equal conditions in practice in the workplace. However, the reality is much more complicated, of course.
Okay, and you and I have been working now for a few months on putting together a workshop about state-owned enterprises common to both Austria and Czechoslovakia in this post-war period as a kind of key site where a lot of the historical phenomena we are interested in, for example, in your case, social justice, are negotiated. So can you talk a little bit more about the way that you find debates about social justice, perhaps the welfare state, playing out in state-owned enterprises in particular? And do you find with the kind of death of state-owned enterprises in both Austria and Czechoslovakia, the death of such, I suppose, historical phenomena?
I think the question of the welfare state and social justice played always a huge role. After 1945, the welfare state and various emancipatory policies rose dramatically in response to economic suffering during the Great Depression and the war experiences, of course. In my paper, I would like to focus on consciousness of class and gender equality related to social redistribution as labor rights. And I studied sources related to trade unions, selected enterprises, and labor court cases. And I found a big difference between contemporary ideals and these social realities. I think that our focus on state-owned enterprises is a practical decision for me It aims to find a common ground for various cases comparing so-called socialist East, democratic West, and global South during the Cold War. I do not think that private enterprises were less important or had a fundamentally different experience, but state-owned enterprises may have had a slightly different position in implementing the norms, which could be visible if we really have a look how these norms were translated from this proclamation into towards the management of the factories and then into everyday practice.
All right, Radka Šustrová, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.